Australia a couple of days ago, and it is 2:30 in the morning for me right now. So if I stumble over my words or have complete brain freeze, you will understand, no doubt. All right, so I'm going to talk about practices of acknowledgement in Australia, and some of my sort of reactions and responses to it in terms of how I have tried to think about performing acknowledgement. This is acknowledgement of country. And if I was in Australia right now, I would say, I'd like to acknowledge that I live and work on Ngunnawal and Ngambri lands, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. And I might extend that acknowledgement in a number of ways. I might talk, for example, about the ongoing custodianship of these lands and the ways in which sovereignty was never ceded over the lands. And I can, within the sort of framework of the convention, I can extend to wider reflections, but most people give a fairly perfunctory acknowledgement. And it is now, it's actually required by my university that one gives an acknowledgement at the opening of events, lectures, meetings, Zoom meetings. When you land on a Qantas plane now, the air hostess reads out an acknowledgement using the slightly problematic phrasing of elders past, present, and emerging, which is a really standard way of doing the acknowledgement that's come into widespread use and is actually really resisted by First Nations people in Australia because of the kind of temporality of emerging, which doesn't really track how elders are thought about. So this is it's become an incredibly normalized act. A bank will display a written acknowledgement on the wall. You know, it's everywhere. Okay. And this comes at a time when Australia is going through a lot of reckoning with its past, a new sort of frame of activism around constitutional recognition that is likely to result in a referendum on constitutional change to provide a voice to Parliament for Indigenous people. So it's a really, I think it's been a really significant part of that background. But I also think it's really quite problematic as a practice. And that's sort of what I want to address today, both in terms of sort of addressing why it's problematic, but also some things I've tried to do in response to that. So I think I have a number of worries and concerns about what acknowledgement does. But one of the central ones is the way in which it consolidates a certain story about identity. And I think just to be quite brief on this point, I think a lot of the kind of critique that goes on in the politics of recognition around what recognition does and the way in which it consolidates the identities of the acknowledger and the one being acknowledged, it's problematic from a number of different directions. Certainly, you know, there's a very strong emphasis on a kind of division of First Nations people that is often represented on a map that shows where everybody belongs. And it's like a little sort of Australia is made to look like Europe in terms of these little sovereign kind of peoples. And of course, that's against the backdrop of a form of dispossession, of you know, completely fracturing those kind of continuities that would represent that relationship with some site of origin. It ignores all the ways in which people from these groups were migratory and didn't have exclusive use of certain territories. That's actually why in Canberra we acknowledge the Ngambri and Ngunnawal people, and that's after a long set of arguments about whether you can acknowledge two groups, both of whom have claims to the land. And there are a lot of, you know, there are very serious ironies in Australia in terms of how land use was granted. You know, when Terra Nullius was overturned in Australia, people have to prove their continuous inhabitation of land. So actually sort of building that into acknowledgement is really problematic because that has been an absolute bleeding sore for many years for Indigenous people. So I think some of these points that are made in terms of recognition being a field of power through which colonial relations get reproduced and maintained, you can apply very well to this case. And also the sort of reflections on what the sovereign state gains through these kind of practices of recognition, I think are really relevant to this case. So, you know, Patchen Markle has a nice kind of critique of this based upon the ways in which sovereignty is rebuilt by acknowledging injustice. And I think this is a really serious concern in the Australian case. Now, all of this is not to say that, you know, it has evolved as a practice. It's really only come into being as a widespread practice in the last 10 years. There are related practices like welcome to country that I won't talk about, but they're also interesting and I think quite problematic. But, you know, there's Indigenous investment in these things. I'm certainly not going to say that I totally think they shouldn't happen. But I think it's really worth reflecting on what we're doing when we engage in them. And I think that it's become a very sort of sacred site in which really only on the right wing is there a kind of sense of outrage about these. You know, I don't think that's certainly not at all where I want to be. And hopefully some of the practices I'll describe will go on to clarify that. But the kind of national work that is going on here, I think, can be seen in some of these statements. The stolen generations is a really central focus of Australian acknowledgement, and really some of the, you know, sort of issues around frontier violence, the actual, you know, what are now being called the Aboriginal wars that went on that produced multiple massacre sites that are only just now being traced and recorded and tracked in Australia. That is very recent, but acknowledgement of practices of taking infants and children from Aboriginal people and putting them into care that then led to them essentially being trained as servants, that's really the sort of long history of what is being acknowledged in Australia. And it's very apparent, I think, in some of these statements that this is seen as past mistreatment. Paul Keating is the first Prime Minister to actually acknowledge in 1992 that we practiced discrimination and exclusion. It was ignorance and prejudice. There's this kind of call that the Governor-General makes for Australia to heal its soul by practicing acknowledgement. And in 2008, Kevin Rudd issues an apology, which is particularly focused again on the stolen generations as a blemished chapter in our nation's history, which does imply that it's past. But interestingly, since the apology, the rate of children actually being taken into care from Indigenous backgrounds is going up and up and up. So it's hard to say that it really belongs to the past. And it's really this kind of statement, today we honour the Indigenous peoples of this land, the oldest continuing cultures in human history. This is the kind of language that feeds through into these widespread acknowledgement practices. Now, one of the ways in which I now want to talk about how I've approached my own practice of giving acknowledgement is through the use of artworks. And I began experimenting with this in the context of a course that I was teaching last year on the philosophy of gender. And it just happened to coincide with a specially curated exhibition at the National Gallery just down the road of art by women, with a very significant representation of Indigenous women's art. And so I decided that in giving an acknowledgement at the start of each lecture, I would spend time thinking about what was being acknowledged in these paintings. And this is one example. This is a painting that I chose because it seemed to illustrate a stolen generations narrative, but also ungrievable life, essentially, was the course was structured every week. There was a keyword, and we spent a lot of time with Judith Butler, and ungrievable was one of the keywords. And what was really interesting about this process was that I often chose something thinking it would illustrate something, and then everything got more complicated. And I think that's one of the great advantages of using art in this way, is that as you spend time looking, things shift and change, and you see more depth in what is happening. I mean, I think clearly, the painting illustrates a certain a way of looking at the idea of the ungrievable life, a life that's remaindered, that is not seen as important, that is not really living, that's there simply to serve. And yet, of course, grievability in Butler's work is a complex idea, right? So ungrievability is a result of a certain kind of narrative that is very closely tied up with the force of law. It's about what cannot be, what's not allowed to be, what's not allowed to exist. If it did exist, it would threaten a whole system of truth and law. But at the same time, it's not that the antithesis of grievability is uncomplicated. So grievability can often be about a dominant form of recognition being allowed to flourish. So the ways in which, for example, Butler talks about grievability in the aftermath of 9/11, where, if you were a US citizen, you got an obituary, and then, everybody who got killed in the Afghan war that followed was completely remaindered life. So recognizability often has as its counterpart a dire unrecognizability. And I think, in her own work, this leads into a reflection on the differences between recognition and apprehension. In a sense, what she asks for in grievability is apprehension, a kind of haunted openness to what doesn't fit in the legitimating framework, and that has a kind of generative relationship to ongoing transformation. It's a very different kind of politics that emerges from that, which is looking for a kind of alliance and cohabitation rather than a recognition of identity that has this kind of unilateral direction to it. And as I looked further at this picture in light of that, it really made me start to think about the black servant cradling this white child. We look at that and readily read it as a scene about the past, but what if it's addressing us now? What if the structure of it is a coexistence that we are invited to look at, even as this gaze is directed out at us? How is it addressing us? What is it asking? And I even began to think of us who act as acknowledgers. I mean, are we like the little white baby here who needs taking care of? Are we the innocent white baby in this picture? And are those who we acknowledge actually being positioned to kind of take care of us through accepting that structure? And even the sun here, if you at first sight, it seems like some sort of common sun unifying, but it's actually got this force field kind of pushing everyone apart. Exactly. So the painting really complicates this scene of acknowledgement in a way that I think is about changing places, finding oneself addressed, rethinking the equatability of grievability with recognition. This is this is actually a still from a video piece, which is called Poles Apart. And it's made by Rhea, who's a Gamilare Waipan Biripi Black queer artist. And it's showing them running through Australian bush that is blackened by fire in this very long Victorian heavy dress that makes her stumble all the time and fall to the ground. And later in the sequence, the figure is running and starts to be spattered by red, white and blue paint, and keeps this kind of almost like a sort of bird falling to the ground and rising and falling to the ground. And the bush is actually bush that was painted in the pioneer paintings of the Heidelberg School, which depicted this kind of completely empty scene. Indigenous people are completely absent from the Heidelberg School, which was only interested in the in the pristineness of this kind of natural world. And so, I mean, the work is referencing at a number of levels. Its references include the experience of the artist's grandmother and great aunt, who both were stolen from their families in 1916 to be trained as servants. And one escaped home through these very woods, and another never again found her family. And so I think the kind of layering of this piece is really multiple. You know, there's a kind of state of nature story here, set against the kind of hyper civility of this Victorian dress in which Rhea stumbles. And at the same time, dress and dressing up and constructing an identity is taking on a certain kind of rhythmic relation to the surrounding trees and the unsettled ground. The past is clearly being referenced, but where we find ourselves in time is a very scrambled kind of problem. And when red, white, and blue paint is thrown, it's really kind of an interesting question how that is producing the kind of identity that is being scripted here. You know, the nationalism of the overlaying paint is assaulting this body as it runs through this natural but haunted world. I've got 5 minutes left and I'm going much more slowly than I thought. But one thing I wanted to point to was, you know, the ways in which this then allows you to raise questions about the kind of theory. So obviously there's all sorts of ways in which you can, my keyword this week was performativity. So thinking about what is being depicted here alongside Butler's story about performativity and the idea that constructing a category that has this coherent and stable identity associated with it reifies, dehistoricizes, omits the kind of genealogical construction. I think that this is a really interesting set of questions to apply to acknowledgement. But of course, you might also use the acknowledgement to push back against Butler. I mean, is there ways in which there's a sort of charted worry about the kind of superficiality that Butler might lead us in the direction of here. But really, I wanted to use this juxtaposition to kind of problematize that space of performativity, to ask how it, how it risks certain things, how it enables certain things, to look at it with that lens. Okay, so I should probably, this is one more. This was just incredibly useful for talking about Butler. Actually, this is a sequence by Tracy Moffat, which has this kind of B-movie graphic novel style. And it's a story of a young Aboriginal girl dressing up in her red dress and going out into the world, and she ends up being murdered. And on the face of it, you know, it's kind of a story of a threat and the kind of ways in which we are, you know, corralled into our identities by virtue of graphic novel B-movie style, actually parodies and sends that up as well. And we are corralled by that force of law because we believe in it, and to show it as a kind of parody is effectively a very powerful counter gesture. So just to sum up, this was a great way of putting, I think, Indigenous work, complex Indigenous work, never coming straightforwardly out of a unified identity, never with a kind of unified temporality or historicity associated with it, allowing that to speak in this space by spending time with these works, I think was a really, it was incredibly valuable for teaching the philosophy of gender, and it was also a way of doing acknowledgement differently. Thank you.
Another one. Yeah, and Fiona, you actually had a minute still to go. 5 minutes is much longer than we think. Thank you for that that lovely presentation. I really enjoy how you're thinking with art and working with art in your pedagogical practices. So a little bit of time for comments, questions. We can't see what's happening in the... Okay, but will you let us know if there are any comments or questions in the... Yeah, thank you.
Fiona, thank you so much. One of the things that always comes to my mind when people put on beautiful and evocative performance artworks of various kinds is, how are these being received? Like, how do the people receive them for whom they're made, as it were? Do you think that the Australian public receives them in a thoughtful and considerate way?
Look, as an empirical question, I don't know. I mean, you know, I think one of the things that was interesting to me was the overlap in some way. One of the things that was interesting to me in this was the many sort of theoretical and practical entwinements of the kind of theoretical moves that someone like Butler is making, and some of the gestures in this art. Whether that inflects what is presented in places like the National Gallery, whether, you might take this further and say, well, these are the kinds of framing of contemporary Indigenous identity that we're comfortable with. But I think they were all very, very rich works. And I think that that's probably being received by some people and not by other people. I mean, certainly my students got an enormous amount out of this. And it was something that, I think just that, learning in a way not to be afraid of looking at art. I think a lot of people have inhibitions about, what you're supposed to say and what you're all supposed to know. And this was very much about, let's just spend time with this and share some of our thoughts and reflections at the beginning. And then it would actually, of its own accord, kind of weave through the class. So, I can't speak about people in general, but I think my students really learn to look at things in a new way and learn to speak about art and work with art in a way that I don't think is much taught in universities.
I have it already. Tammy. I'm like, I have it already, but I whispered into the mic. Thank you. So a lot of the ways we've been talking about address has been about the audience as though it's external, but of course what you've shown in the acknowledgement and the apologies, the point of address becomes the self. I think we were talking about main character energy at lunch, where like, I'm sorry to myself as the main and so that I thought that's interesting, and in particular because it's structured by a sentimental structures, in me thinking of James Baldwin's use, but also songs we're talking about JB's Baby Mama, in terms of the wounded attachment, but also the subject of true feeling in Wendy Brown's work. The subject of true feeling, of course, is the subject that is the main character whose apologies to.
Yes.
And to come back around to this address, in terms of the description, the use of the noun in terms of even the address, this came to me, actually, I was with people not as academics, but as social change people, but also academics in terms of how we get money. Often you're like, oh, the money is a bit dodgy, but I'm going to use it for good things. And I'm realizing a lot of the money we get is because we are literally the buffer between revolution and not sometimes. Because I'm in a group of people talking about, I do this work, and the person leading us is Australian woman who kept saying, she was, like people clutch their cross, like it's saving them from your devil. Like she was clutching onto this and she kept saying, oh, the same apology, acknowledging, oh, Indigenous people in Australia. And it was, and I was like, and I couldn't hear anything about her. It was literally like the subject was Indigenous people. And that was the ground at which any kind of virtue was constructed, but it was all about her main character. And so at some point she's like, we need to get cameras and tell people their stories. And I felt like I was going crazy. I'm with my child and in this conference space. And then I put my hand up and I say, wouldn't it be easier to give the land back? Because you're going through the most. And then there was dead silence. And back to also what I think implied in Dina and Jaja's conversations about trust, going back to Elena, trust because trust is this, like also the thread that you're trying to think through, what would it look like in the acknowledgement? And so in that moment, I cried the whole day. It was awkward. I didn't go to the next few days because when you do speak with trust, even though no one wants to hear it, it was a very normal common sense thing to say, give the land back, it's easier, but it hurt someone's feelings. And it's like putting my lipstick on to go hurt some feelings today was not my personal situation, but it does happen. And then I'm hurting my own feelings because then I'm going to cry. There's no trust in that sense, right? Because the point of address, there is no acknowledgement because the structure is to address the self. And so when an opening for trust is there, then it's hurt, which I think is partly what love and hate do in that gap of trust. I think I've made my circle, and then I was going to say, and it seems then to be a shift in language from the noun to the point of address. So the way that I would say something where we think of description and noun, everything becomes a noun in its performative use in translation. But if I'm addressing someone with the trusting intention, then my linguistic register will change or the grammar will change. It may be an adverb or an adjective or, because the address is related to what I intend in a conversation that's not just one main character, but in relation to another, which is a different sense of recognition than even if we don't agree. I don't know if I'm making sense. I tried my best.
Very interesting reflections. And I think that whole question of address and how you're addressed, and I mean that's again what's really interesting about putting these artworks into play, because they do address you and they do kind of they speak in a context where otherwise you are the person acknowledging who's speaking, right? And these are ways of speaking and addressing that interrupt that circuitry, I think, in really powerful ways. Yeah.
Let me take one last question because we did start 2 minutes late.
Abshiri, thank you very much for the presentation and for the work you're doing and just trying to think of doing things differently. I'm not so sure if it's a question or maybe just a comment and maybe just throwing something in the room and maybe for us to think about. And please forgive me because I definitely wouldn't want to talk about Australia or culture or anything like that, because I think in terms of the art and just what you presented, I often think about acknowledging, and I think that, when you see Australian people present and they do the acknowledgement, and it becomes like in South Africa where people just use Ubuntu because it's just the word, and people just catch on these phrases and they just catch on to these like these practices that just gets done. And so I've always thought of acknowledgement it's about honoring. And I think that when you just acknowledge someone, in my understanding of English, which is not really great because, as you know, English is not my first language, but in acknowledgement, it's about acknowledging something. But when you honor something, when you show the honor of the act or space or the place or the people, there's a difference for me. And so I was just thinking about your thoughts on the honoring. And then I was just thinking about, have you maybe thought about how using art in this way is in any way perpetuating a particular because this is what the conference is asking us to think about. In which ways are we thinking of, are we perpetuating the things that we are challenging? And if you maybe stumbled over some of the things that in this project you stopped and thought, oh, you know, like, is this something that I must check myself on, or something that I must rethink about, or yeah. So just about honoring, and maybe just what your thoughts are on. Thank you.
Yeah, so honoring, I think that's definitely part of the intention of acknowledgement. And as I said, people will talk about, you know, the beautiful land, and I mean, it's supposed to be acknowledgement of country, which is quite significant in its own right. So we'll, you know, I think there is an honoring that is going on there that people feel very strongly about. Like it's become a very sacred kind of thing to do. And something that, you know, you'd certainly, like, if you didn't do it, it would be a very negative kind of thing. But then, of course, because of that, it becomes difficult for it to, you know, I think there's all sorts of interesting philosophical questions about even sincerity. And when you have a ritual, you know, what's the sincerity? What's the act of honoring? And, you know, you give the acknowledgement whilst occupying the platform of the land that, of course, you decide totally who comes in and out. And, you know, you are actually sovereign as you acknowledge, you know, this. So it's just a very problematic space, I think, and difficult to honor. But I mean, often, you know, it does work in certain ways and it doesn't in others. In terms of questioning, yeah, look, I mean, I'm very aware that this is a sort of very particular subset of artworks that I chose, and that although I speak about them having voice, which I do think they do, I have more voice perhaps in terms of how I lead the discussion on them. But they certainly, I mean, what's wonderful about spending time with an artwork is it questions you, and you start from a certain point, you start saying certain things about the work, and then you realize that there's a whole way of reversing that and seeing it differently. And I think it's that mobility and creating a sort of space of acknowledgement that has that mobility, you know, that has that richness of perspectivism kind of built into it. I think that's really, it becomes an exploratory space in which you're actually able to track certain things and look at things. And that's really valuable, I think, in the context of this very established ritualistic kind of practice.
Diana, thank you so much, especially performing so articulately, given that it's 2:30 in the middle of the morning. Thank you. Next up, we have Professor Lou-Marie Kruger, who is from the University of Stellenbosch, Professor of Psychology, and who will be delivering a paper entitled Rage. Welcome, Lou-Marie. Lovely to see you.
Hi, Tammy. Thank you. And thank you for all of you hanging in there. This is late in the afternoon, and I hope you can still listen. I have asked the organizers to put up my slideshow for me. Okay. Okay, you can go to the second slide, actually. Okay, so I'm going to read the paper just so that I can keep my time. So I've entitled my paper Rage, but it's a paper with perhaps more questions than answers. I'm asking, why is it that our current time is referred to as, and I quote, the age of rage? Why is it that so many very different feminist scholars, so-called white stream feminists such as Judith Butler, Martha Nussbaum, Jacqueline Rose, among others, but also feminists of color in the Western world, such as African-American scholar Miesha Cherry, are writing about rage, all claiming that feminists are raging. In this paper, I will quickly review the recent feminist literature about rage, linking it to a very substantial older feminist literature about rage. Given the focus of this conference, Decolonizing Feminisms, I would like to pose the question of how the recent rage literature and the work of more classic rage scholars such as Audre Lorde and Bell Hooks may be relevant in a country like South Africa. I also want to ask why we are not talking more about rage in South Africa. And to give you some background, and you can go to the next slide, I've been thinking about anger a lot and rage a lot because I see it a lot, and we can talk about that in question time. But I'm by far not the only South African psychologist interested in rage. In the 2018 special issue of the South African Journal of Psychology, issue focusing on psychology and decolonization, Wits community psychology, Hugo Canham, writes, rage is under-theorized in South Africa. This absence is more pronounced in psychological scholarship. This is a remarkable oversight, he contends, as we have infamy as the world's epicenter of protest action. It's an odd omission. This odd gap that Canham identified and discussed in 2018 still exists and is an interesting one, given that we live in a time that has been termed the age of rage, but specifically in a country where rage seems to feature so prominently. The prominence of race is not only clear in the frequency and intensity of protest action in this country, as Canham argues, it's also implicit in the widespread epidemic of violent crime and interpersonal violence in our country, where men and women of all classes and races are perpetual targets of violence and or are perpetrators of violence themselves. You can go to the next slide, and where I give you some definition of rage and anger. But what we know is that rage is closely associated with irritability, frustration, anger, indignation, resentment, all considered to be emotions on some kind of spectrum of emotional behavioral states that vary in intensity. Rage is often thought to be a form of anger that is uncontrollable or overwhelming or violent. Cherry, however, argues in her 2021 book about rage, entitled The Case for Rage, Why Anger is Essential to Anti-Racist Struggle, that rage, and I quote, does not deserve its bad reputation. While some would argue that rage, unlike anger, always has an active element, rage is not always overtly expressed and does not always manifest in political protest actions or interpersonal violence. When a protest action occurs or violence erupts, rage has often been simmering for a long time. Rage is often also obscured for various reasons. As a psychologist, I'm very aware of how often rage and anger are perceived to be shameful and therefore consciously or unconsciously internalized or repressed, resulting in severe psychological distress. Despite its intensity, then, rage is not always clearly articulated, and particularly in the case of women, it is often internalized and not acted upon in overt ways. The question is not only who is allowed to feel rage and to express rage, it also is an issue that societal perceptions and evaluations of rage depends on who is expressing it. This often has to do with issues of power. Those who are powerful are more likely to express rage. Their rage is also more accepted and less criticized. The rage gap in our South African literature is also particularly striking, given that there are so many feminists writing about feminists who are raging. These are the words of the editor of a 2021 special issue of the feminist journal Science. The special issue is in fact called Rage. Related to the question of who is allowed to feel and express rage, I want to ask the question about who gets to speak about rage and who is allowed to speak about whose rage. But that's the question that I'm not going to go into now. In this paper, I would like to discuss psychology and psychiatry's lapses with regard to naming, understanding, and using rage. And you can go to the next slide. I'm using this rather simple outline to organize my thoughts about what is missing and why. In the end, I want to explore how rage, when recognized, understood, and managed or used deliberately, has the potential to become an energizing and constructive force rather than a destructive one. Clinical psychologist Wahbi Long, in his 2021 book Nation on the Couch, couch inside South African's mind, writes eloquently and analytically about resentment or slow anger, but he also states that his objective is, and I quote, to demonstrate the pervasiveness of envious resentment in our public spaces, an effective condition, he says, that extends far beyond the squalid environment inhabited by our poor and working classes. Long's empirical claim about the pervasiveness of anger, as stated above, is supported in my own clinical work and research. I have found anger and rage to be everywhere. As a white South African scholar and clinical psychologist, I hear about rage constantly. I hear it in my research work and in my clinical work. I'm going to give you a few examples. I have many, many more. There's, for instance, an unemployed mother of 3 diagnosed with depression who talks about lashing out at her kids. Want almal vra vir my vir 'n stukkie brood, because everyone asks me for a piece of bread. She feels anxious, sad, and ashamed about not being able to feed her children and consequently is enraged. Just as prominent is the rage of a professional white woman in her 40s, having to be home in the afternoons to care for a young daughter whose relentless neediness and complaints manifest in an outraged outburst. Don't say mommy, there's no longer a mommy in this house. A farm worker I see is referred for therapy as he regularly beats up his wife. While his rage is not very apparent in his rather deflated appearance, his rage is lingering just beyond the surface, a rage that he himself can link to being beaten by his father for bedwetting. The systematic shaming of this man might have started with his father, but persisted in how he was treated by his male friends, his boss, the police, the political system as a whole. His wife, also a farm worker, still breastfeeding a small baby, exhausted and depleted, talks about how she, in a fit of rage, attacked her husband with a kettle of boiling water. Years of being exposed not only to one violent man, but a system of patriarchy sent her over the edge and made her rage eventually come to the surface. I can go on. A wealthy white businessman I see in couples therapy is terrorizing his wife, children, and dogs with his demands for obedience and respect, his rage manifesting in drunken temper tantrums, dangerous road rage, and obsessive attempts to control his wife's sexuality and schedule. His wife, apparently meek and mild, is also enraged, even if she's not conscious of her rage, and subversively resists him by spending his money, lying about his schedule, and playing around on Tinder. A high school person sits in my office deeply enraged that their parents and teachers can't be convinced to call them by the new gender-neutral name that they so carefully chose, with much time and effort being spent on the official changing of the name. Those are examples of the clinical cases I'm confronted with. But as a South African, I'm confronted with rage on a daily basis in the media. We saw it in Fees Must Fall. We see it in the protests about housing and water. We saw it in the last year's uprisings in KwaZulu-Natal. But there are also individual cases of rage that we see in the media. A female doctor who murders her 3 children in Australia. A young girl who's raped, mutilated, and killed in a rural town. A grandmother recently from Malanga who killed her grandchildren because they were hungry and she had no food to give them. Despite our clinical experience and anecdotal evidence about the prominence of rage in our context, in reviewing the South African psychological literature on anger and rage, it is indeed, as Canham says, quite obvious how little empirical research has been conducted specifically about the emotions of anger and rage in South Africa. This is while there is an abundant psychological literature about violence. I wonder whether it is that we shy away from empirical research about emotions in general, or is it that we avoid the difficult emotions like anger and rage? Why are we more interested in the violent consequences of anger and rage, but we do not engage with the feelings that often are at the root of violence? Frequently an anger or rage that is legitimate or at least understandable. This failure to acknowledge rage in psychology is not surprising, and in formal diagnostic systems such as the DSM-5, anger and rage are hardly mentioned. I did a whole survey. It's simply not acknowledged. While traditional psychological studies have not really investigated rage specifically, there's a plethora of international studies showing that men are more prone to anger than women and express it more. I'm not going to review this extensive literature here, but if you can go to the following slide. Bell Hooks wrote in 1996, you can go to the next slide. I think it's 2 slides down. Yeah. Currently, we are bombarded daily with mass media images of Black rage, usually personified by angry young Black males wreaking havoc upon the innocent, that teach everyone in the culture to see this rage as useless, without meaning, destructive. This one-dimensional misrepresentation of the power of rage helps maintain the status quo. It ensures that there will be no revolutionary effort to gather that rage and use it for constructive social change. It is 25 years later, and Hook's comments seem to be written about South Africa, where Black men's rage are characterized as toxic, but their so well documented violent actions are seldom connected to any legitimate or understandable rage. Women's rage is not acknowledged, as it is often not expressed in visible ways, or it is expressed in the domestic sphere, where it's not seen. When it is seen, it's often pathologized in disorders like major depressive disorder, borderline personality disorder, and so on. The stereotype of the angry Black woman in particular is one that seems pertinent. In the special issue of Science on Rage, it is stated that the stereotype of Black women's anger, also the anger of Black feminist scholars themselves, is, and I quote, impoverished by virtue of being too much, too angry, too lamenting, too additive, too exclusive, too universalizing, too dominating, too authoritative, too Black, too specific, too myopic, too generalizable, too defensive, too close. You can go to the next slide. Taryn Williamson says, what does it mean to be too close to anger? One of the editors of the special issue of Science writes wryly and critically, Black feminist criticism, regularly deposited in well-placed quotes for its effectively loaded theoretical contributions to understandings of the operation of power, is also simultaneously condemned as a bad object for being effectively disordered. It is perhaps here where the biggest schism between white and Black feminists have come to the fore. While rage is considered problematic for all people identifying as women, Black and white women's ways of dealing with rage seem to be different, or then differently noticed and differently sanctioned. This is clearly repeated in how Black and white women have tended to write quite differently about rage. Also, while white women can afford to not be enraged about issues of race, Black women cannot. This issue seems to be crucial in a time where feminists are reasserting the importance for collective action. In my work as a psychologist and also as a practicing clinician, I find once we've identified the rage, it's important to link the emotion to whatever makes sense to the patient, the group, or even the community. You can go to the next slide. And in psychology, there are different ways of understanding this rage, which I will not go into now. Next slide also. If we have named rage and try to understand it, link it to what has happened to us both, and I want to insist intrapsychically and politically, it seldom feels so out of control and overwhelming. We can figure out what to do with the feeling. While I say this as a clinician, this take on rage seems inadvertently present in the work of all prominent rage scholars. You can go to the next slide. When eminent feminist scholar Judith Butler says in 2020, people, you can go down one slide more, people in the world have every reason to be in a state of total rage. What we do with that rage together is important. Rage can be crafted, it's a sort of an art form of politics. She is in fact naming the rage, giving reasons for it, and thinking about what to do with it. She talks about the political utility of rage, the art and craft of rage, what to do with rage together. These notions that rage can be useful and productive, that it can be creative, and that it should inform collective action are already present in the work of Lord. You can go to the next slide. She says, the editors of Science say, decades of feminist work have conceptualized women's anger as both burden and power, theorizing the transition between them and emphasizing the creative potential of rage. It has now been more than 30 years since Jane Marcus wrote that anger is a primary source of creative energy. Focused with precision, Audre Lorde wrote in 1981, rage can become a powerful source of energy, serving progress and change. Every woman has a well-stocked arsenal of anger, potentially useful against these oppressions, personal and institutional, which brought that anger into being. Similarly, in her early text, Killing Rage, Ending Racism, Bell Hooks devotes much attention to unveiling rage's healing possibilities and its propensities to bolster self-actualization, heighten self-determination, and catalyze constructive change. For Hooks, progressive activists who reckon with their own rage have the responsibility to show how to take that rage and move it beyond the fruitless scapegoating of any group, linking it instead to a passion for freedom and justice that illuminates, heals, and makes redemptive struggle possible. Lorde and Hooks may sound like old hat for many, but for me, it's interesting how their work seems highly relevant, again, in the enraged work, but also in South Africa, in the political arena, also in my clinic and in my practice room. Cherry, in her book, The Case for Rage, Why Anger is Essential to Anti-Racist Struggle 2021 book, introduced the concept of Lordian rage, as in Audre Lorde, a rage that aims for change, motivates productive action, builds resistance, and is informed by an inclusive and liberating perspective. She says, and you can go to the next slide, Lordian rage brings motivation to something, actually next slide, to join an organization, to give money, to sign a petition, to protest in the street. That's the kind of anger that I believe is virtuous. It's the kind of anger that I see is necessary to really bring about a better world. There also is the emphasis on the collective in Lorde's work on rage. And next slide, in the words of Cherry, Lordian rage is not only concerned about how you can be a victim of injustice, it's also concerned about how anyone could be a victim of injustice. So it's very much inclusive. It's not self-centered. One of the things that Audre Lorde talks about in the uses of anger, and she's talking specifically to white feminists, is the notion that as a Black educated woman, she's not free, that we're not free until third world women are free, until poor women are free. It's a very inclusive kind of anger. Although you're comfortable, if others are struggling, you are not free. She focuses specifically on the transformative power of rage. But the third aspect of Lordian rage that feels prominent in my reading of Lorde is the emphasis on the creative, or as Butler says, the craft and art of rage. And you can go to the next slide. What happens?
Can you wrap up, please, Yamari?
Okay. So collective action is also very important. And I just want to make a quick distinction also because it's relevant to the previous speaker and her reference to complex indigenous artworks. Maria Lugone's Decolonial Feminist says that there are two types: first order anger and second order rage, and the first would be more formal, where we are speaking to those who oppress us in petitions, lawsuits, protests, assemblies, but that it's actually the second order rage is the emphasis is on the creative, the instinctual, the ritual. it's embodied and corporeal. It celebrates rage by highlighting vulnerability. And I think I can, and I have many examples in my slides, but I think the artwork that we saw might be in the previous session might be good examples of that. So I want to end with the saying, when repressed or disavowed or obscured, rage can potentially lead to self-destructive thoughts or behaviors and violent acts. When seen, attended to, and recognized, named and understood, the same rage has potential to sprout forth into a creativity that can bring healing to past wrongs and seed a revolution.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Marie.
Have I gone over time?
Thanks for that very provocative engagement with rage. I'm sorry to have pressurized you around time. You did get to just over 20 minutes, but we have a few minutes for comments or questions, or you can take the time. Comments, questions in the room? In the cyber room? Yeah, we have 2 comments, questions over there. Let's take both maybe, and then give Marie time.
Thanks very much, Marie. This was just fantastic. And it's a question that I've been very troubled by, especially as we're working with, issues around violence and masculinity. And I'm not even sure if the question that I'm asking is the right sort of question, but what is then the relationship between these DSM-5 categories and violence and rage? Is there such a correlation? What is the work of neuroscience, saying to us about violence? We are all in rage. I mean, when you talked about rage, it's like we all have, and have indeed, we have the capacities to be enraged, and we oftentimes are enraged. But how then do you the fine line between the rage and what we've seen in this country in terms of gendered violence and sexual violence? I'm just, do you get what I'm saying?
Well, I really think that psychology has really failed us in not taking, psychology is obsessed at the moment with diagnostic systems and giving people a diagnosis, but often there's no investigation of what are the feelings below those, what is the affect that informs a diagnosis of depression or so on. And I became interested in rage specifically because I interviewed women who have been diagnosed with depression and sent to me. And when I interviewed them, this was low-income women here in the Western Cape, I realized that they are furious. They are just incredibly angry. So, but they're treated with medication, for depression. So, but when you ask them why they're angry, they have very legitimate reasons for being angry. Their children are hungry. They're badly treated at work. They're treated badly at work. I think we need to, and we're all saying men are more violent, and men, women are, and women are the victims of violence. But I think, as you pointed out, everyone is enraged, and I think psychology can help us to listen why people are enraged, and often there are legitimate reasons for that, so that people won't act on it, in destructive ways, but more, I have pictures of, the whole Kwezi, Zuma and the women protesting. That's an example of collective rage that is actually very effective politically.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your presentation. and I think maybe you were just touching on it now when you were talking about the whole, basically my question is really about how do we direct the rage in a way, how do you like envision directing the rage in a way that it's useful, especially in the context of South Africa, you know, where the structures themselves are still not, you know, listening in a sense, and do we really just not hit a dead end where you're really trying to break through in a structure that is not accommodating to your experience, your standpoint? And so how then do we, you know, navigate that kind of space and make the rage or the violence and the anger that comes with it useful?
Mhm. Well, you know, I wish we could talk about more, because this is a question that your question is the one that I want to put to all feminists. What can we do collectively, white and Black women, third world women and first world women, to express rage about patriarchy, about racism, about what's happening in the environment? I think the previous speakers' examples of the indigenous art would be an example, but rap music, you know, feminist art. We've just had a conference in Stellenbosch where we had a lot of feminist art, and it often can be read as or interpreted as a protest against what's going on. But that is really my question, and I wish we can do more with this rage that I think is legitimate and can be very productive.
Thanks, Lou Marie. We've got one more question, then we have to move on in the interest of time. Danai?
I'll be much quicker than normal. I was thinking about latent rage, like passive aggression, often assigned to particular forms of femininity. Like when I'm being passive aggressive, I've been accused by a lover often of being speaking white lady, because then often the rage. So because then it's the sense that the person who is the source of trouble becomes the person. It's self-harming. It's not a good way to communicate, but then one also becomes the victim of it in that process. And so the rage is directed to you, even though you are directing it inwards. But other kinds of latent forms, and so I'm talking about, it's gendering of rage, but it's also racialized gendering. When I'm saying I speak white lady, that's passive aggression, right? Mm-hmm. And I asked Tammy this once in a session about this question of whose rage matters, like young Black boys. Like this thing of urinating on other people, which is not considered rage, but it's weird. Like, who was teaching you to do that? Like, and I'm curious to ask you, like, how does that make sense to, you know, pee on someone non-sexually, non-consensually?
Well, I do think it's a rage, and it's a rage that is not, it's white Afrikaner men's rage, you know, there's something, and the example that I read of the white businessman who is so enraged, that's also a rage that is both political and intrapsychic. And I think we're not going to solve this problem of what's happening on my campus if we don't acknowledge that these boys are out of control. And in my case now, it's difficult because I don't think their rage is legitimate in this case, but they are enraged because they want to be the boss of the class, the big boss, so and I think and that kind of rage needs to be named, and it has to be that's and someone, I have been thinking about, but there would be expressions of rage that are, of course, destructive and violent. And that would be an example of that, I think. But I think it's worth paying attention to it, that it's not simply a drunken boy being silly. It is an enraged, dangerous man that does that kind of thing.
There is a comment online. I hope it's a comment, not a question. Can we just read it? And then we need to move on in the interest of time.
I can't see the comment.
Okay. Can we?
Okay, I think it's from Prof. Karen. I think she wants to speak.
Karen, is it?
Fine. May I speak?
Yeah,
Yes, sure.
But we're going to have to be very quick because we've already run out of time and we're running late. Is it burning? Burning, go ahead.
Well, I just, I mean, I've been troubled by this question of emotions, political emotions, and how to politicize emotions and how to deal with them. And, in the light of that, I was thinking of a couple of presentations before yours. There was talk of hate speech and, the talk of the legitimacy around certain kinds of speech. And you yourself said, you don't legitimize certain things. But there is something like right-wing rage, and it's all over. And I think that's one of the difficulties when emotions are legitimized in a public space. I'm just giving you a very abbreviated sort of question. So how would you respond to something like that? I mean, I'm thinking about Martha Nussbaum talking about political emotions and the necessity of them. But right-wing rage is also political emotion and a set of political emotions. How do we, when you open that particular door, I don't know what else you let in with it.
I will say, and this is the psychologist speaking, and I'll be very quick, Tammy, that you can always say, okay, this is how you're feeling, but if you are acting on that feeling in a destructive way, it's not okay. And, I don't necessarily agree with what you're feeling. I'm not feeling the same. But the moment that feeling goes over into any destructive action that is aimed at humiliating the other, then, that's where I will draw the line. So, but it is, I get your question. I wish we had longer to speak about.
Yeah, I think it's complex and it's contested and the conversation will go on. Marie, thank you so much. And I'm the very worst chair to have put on in the last session because I'm totally flexible. And I really didn't want to stop that conversation, but I want to introduce, thank you, Marie. I want to introduce Pilar Milagro Garciano from the University of Bogazici, Istanbul. Thank you for being here and for being so patient and waiting right till the end. It's really, I think it's a privileged position to be right at the end, to be the last note that is left with us. No pressure, Pilar, but it's lovely to see you, and over to you. And don't worry, we're not going to restrict your time. We've been here so long, we might as well stay another few minutes. Okay, over to you.
So can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
I panicked because yesterday I tried to hear me, so today I decided to do it with my headphones and just talk like this. First of all, I would like to thank the organizing committee for accepting my proposal and all the people who made it possible. I can imagine.
Pilar, sorry, we can't actually hear you. Have you got another mic on or something, or another computer nearby? Any idea? Yeah.
I wonder why. Hold on. I don't understand what's going on.
There's an echo and a multiple voice thing.
I don't have any other computers. It's just me on my computer. I'm not using any headphones or anything precisely because that didn't work yesterday. So you can't hear me. I can try connecting with my cell phone, but then I'll need help with my slides.
Yeah, we can change the slides on this side.
Okay.
Does that work?
Yeah, I think it might be easier for us to change the slides from our side. Is that okay?
I can tell you what to change because I have an outline.
Do you want to try disconnect your video?
Hold on. I haven't used so
It sounds better. Strange, yeah. It's her signal.
let me tether myself. That should take care of it. So can you hear me better now?
Sounds like there are two mics on.
Okay.
Have you got a phone on by chance? Or?
Let me see. Sorry about that. I did not expect this.
Is it her line?
Can you just get anybody else online? Anyone that's online?
Can somebody else online say something? Jaja, can you say something? We just want to see if this is a general problem or Pilar's problem.
No, I can hear everything. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
I'm saying something now.
that's perfect. You can, yeah.
Okay, so I'm fine.
Can
I-
you hear me better now?
Pilar, do you want to try
Yes.
again?
Can you hear me better now?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
But do you want us to put your PowerPoint on now?
Sorry about that. Should we try the video again?
No.
No.
No. Okay. I'll be the faceless. That's what I'm concerned about.
That sounds better.
Sounds better?
Yes, absolutely.
Sorry about that. And here we thought we
No.
were done. Or we'd be
No,
done.
there's still an echo.
I wonder why though.
Oh, do you want to tell? It's Pilar, Prof. Pilar.
Good afternoon to you, Prof. Maybe if you just try your cell phone, don't share any presentations or any video. And then let's see, maybe just get your voice only, and then we can perhaps change your slides from this side if that's possible. So we're just going to do a test. Maybe just from your cell phone, could be your cell phone signal could be a little bit stronger than what you're using now.
But it's still not working, right?
No, yeah, okay.
No.
That's not working. No.
Okay. So I'm just gonna connect to Zoom on my computer, and then in the meantime you can start loading my presentation.
So you are sounding a bit better, but I think it's just an intimate thing that's going off and on your side. Because sometimes your voice just gets clear and then it's just distorts after that.
With my cell phone, so at least you can maybe get a better I don't know. I'm trying that right now.
Okay.
So
Yeah, just switch off your mic on your PC, or just have one mic on.
Is this better now? Let's try. So can you hear me actually?
Yes, that's clear, much better.
Okay. Shall I still try to share my own screen again then? I can actually, this is really weird. I'm in two places.
Yeah. Okay, let's just try it. If let's try it for a minute and let's see. If it doesn't, then we'll just go back to that.
I really owe a double thanks. I was already planning on thanking the audience for staying until the very last minute. I know this has been two very, very long days.
Okay, that's working better. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Well, as I said before, now I don't even know where to look at. I should probably look at my cell phone because that's where I'm actually getting the sound and everything. So I would like to thank, I would have loved to be there at Durban, but unfortunately this block hasn't, and this time around it hasn't worked out. I'm going to thank you, and I'm going to also warn you that my voice is terrible. I've had a cold for 4 weeks, and I normally don't make it 20 minutes without coughing. So here's hoping it doesn't happen this time around. So thank you very much once more for all the work you've done, and to the audience for staying and putting up with all my problems with technology. Just as Professor Lukic was talking about this afternoon, when I proposed this presentation, I think I got a little bit too enthusiastic with the topic. So I was thinking of trying to attach and address all the issues at hand. However, as I prepared the paper, this has taken me in a slightly different direction. So the title is still Artistic Praxis and Transnational Decolonial Solidarity, Artists as Potential Agents to Decolonize, but it's more like decolonize course curricula and academia, and of course feminism as being part of that academia. This idea of decolonizing academia and course curricula has been part of my concern in my academic life for a long time. Actually, Tommy said, I'm from Boğaziçi University. That's what I used to be until last year. But now I'm at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. I've just academic contexts, but still what I'm presenting you today is part of what I started working on while I was still in Turkey. And it's part of this idea that as a scholar, I believe we should, as a scholar from an English literature and cultural studies background, we should decolonize our course curricula and academia in general. So in 1946, George Orwell wrote an essay titled Why I Write, and he outlined 4 different reasons why writers engage their pen. But to me, the most interesting one is the 4th one, and that's the political purpose, which he defines as the desire to push sorry, I can't really the desire to push the world in a certain direction, to alter other people's ideas of the kind of society that they should strive after. The opinion that art should have nothing to do with politics, it is itself a political attitude. And in the same way, I understand that perhaps not all literature will be political or is political, and not all teaching about literature should be political. But to me, that's the one that is of interest, and that's the one that I always engage with, texts that are political in nature. In the same way, Ellen Cushman in 1996 said that rhetoric and composition scholars should utilize their skills, resources, and position of power to promote social change via civic participation. So I contend, similarly, that literature and rhetoric and cultural studies scholars should not only empower students in our classrooms by providing them with tools to understand our literary past, but also by creating safe spaces in the classroom in which students can discuss social issues of relevance via cultural texts in an attempt to also connect to our present and our future. Finally, we should also empower students by bridging gaps between the university and our larger community. So, as an educator, who attempts to both help students find ways to discuss crucial social issues, and to critically analyze cultural texts that may or may not help decolonize Western academic practices, for example, what counts as knowledge, then I do contend that our classroom spaces should engage in that. Because I do think that if we utilize our classrooms both to increase conscientization about current social issues and to offer critical spaces for students to discuss those honestly, then those students may also continue that task later on in the larger communities. So that brings me back to, so what is a current social issue that we should discuss? As we saw in one of the panel discussions yesterday, gender-based violence is indeed one of those topics that necessitates transnational awareness and alliances. So in an era of transnationalism, I think that artistic expressions such as Las Tesis, Un Violador en tu Camino, is a text that's, air quotes, from the global South, can offer a renewed transnational awareness about gender-based violence. And texts like these ones create affordances for feminist scholars in that we may rethink the transnational feminist frameworks that disrupt the prevailing North-South dichotomies, among many other dichotomies. It is based on this kind of text and the affordances that it can create, that I've chosen a visual medium to discuss how we can decolonize our curriculum and ultimately what counts as knowledge by incorporating texts that are from the global South and the global East, and that they are transnational in that they're not constrained to nation-state borders, because especially one of the cultural texts we will discuss has indeed transgressed geographical borders. So, moving on. If, like I said before, we attempt to help our students become critical and engage in civic action, then we need to incorporate cultural texts, because according to Zimanek, for example, activists and academics in Mexico have many times coined new language, new words that stay away from Spanish and also from English by resisting colonial epistemology. So since we are looking for resistance or for decolonizing epistemology, among other things, then there is affordance in that particular thing. So again, if we do that, then we have to consider what is that we are teaching and we are engaging our students with. Of course, the fact that a text comes from the global East or global South doesn't really mean that it may decolonize or it may decolonize academia. And more, I will discuss more about this particular question later on. So, as I said before, I focused on two installations, and the reason for that is while I was in Turkey and I started thinking of this project of what kind of texts I could use in my class to create honest conversations about gender-based violence, I came across an interview with Bahit Tuna, who's a Turkish graphic designer, talking about his installation titled Simsiz, untitled in English. And then after doing some research, I discovered that the original person who started these installations to commemorate victims of gender-based violence was a Mexican artist, Alina Chauvet. And so my intention is to explore whether, and if so, how those transnational artistic installations and the transgressions in which they may engage, may or may not engage, can help us actually decolonize our curriculum and academia. So in general, my project is informed by many different theoretical frameworks, decolonial feminism being but one of them. But for the particular purposes of this presentation, I want to focus on how language and images make meaning. So I focus on cultural violence as a concept, and this was coined by Galton, who described those aspects of culture, the symbolic sphere of our existence, exemplified by religion and ideology, language and art, and that can be used to justify or legitimize violence, structural and direct violence. On the other hand, Rojas Blanco, a Mexican activist and academic, defines cultural violence as being concerned with discriminatory processes regarding race, ethnicity, class, gender, religion, and other constructs related to socio-cultural differences. So, according to Rojas, language postulates itself as an institution and a complex social action that could indeed be abused. Hence, such language use and or abuse should be understood within particular contextual and political situations. Language commits violence, but the most dangerous thing is it naturalizes violence. If things are not nuanced and named, feminicidio, feminicide in Mexico, and gendercide in Turkey, then they cannot be understood or reconstructed. So another framework for this particular presentation, because I am very interested in the connection of images and words, is critical discourse analysis, because it can help us understand and examine how particular people or groups are visually depicted or even made invisible, and what these may tell us about their status and power in society. Obviously, I also use critical discourse analysis because it does allow me to understand how these artistic installations may construct subjects that have been previously silenced, according to Hansen, 2000, and whose imposed identities perpetuate certain preferred gender roles. As aforementioned, I'm particularly interested in the interaction between language and images, and this is why I've also incorporated 2 interviews. Actually, originally the text by Alina Chauvet was a video, but is no longer available. So I've instead looked at her to offer interviews and some of the pictures of her installations. But I looked at visual social semiotics because as images or as symbolic meaning-making systems, language and images make meaning, produce meaning. And according to Harrison and Kress van Leeuwen, images perform 3 metasemiotic tasks, but I'm particularly interested in the interpersonal metafunction, because these are texts that were created to create consciousness or to really engage change. So there has to be a connection and interaction between the text and the viewer by creating intimate distance. So part of my rationale is understanding whether and how these artistic installations create this intimacy with the viewer in a way that they can affect how they think about domestic gender-based violence and whether they do something to change it in the future. So ultimately, I will be examining also ideologies present in those particular installations. And of course, since the text I examined and used for my classroom was from Turkey, and then the original one was from Mexico, I wanted to briefly talk about why I'm looking at gender-based violence. And that's because in Ciudad Juárez, Mexico, over 1,000 girls have been brutally murdered since 1983. And to the point that Lagarde, a feminist scholar, coined the word femicide, which is genocide against women. And it occurs when the historical conditions generate social practices that allow for violent attempts against the integrity, health, liberties, and lives of girls and women. And finally, according to the National Public Security System in Mexico, an average of 10 women were killed every day in Mexico during 2021. Femicide continues on the rise in 2022, and very few of the men who've perpetrated that violence have actually been charged with anything. In Turkey, many feminist organizations in the 80s and 90s lobbied for changes in gender equality in Turkey. That combined with, and so they push for governmental policies of gender-based violence prevention. And then, of course, the internal pressure together with the external pressure, which was that the EU said or promised Turkey that if they did engage in some gender equality policies, then they would consider their accession to the European Union seriously. So there were many different changes. There was a new penal code, a new civil code. Crimes against women were against crimes against the individual, not against a member of the family, etc., etc. But as is the case in Turkey, the problem is always not that there aren't any gender violence prevention policies, but that their implementation is rather problematic. And in fact, a woman is murdered every 2 days. So now moving on to, now you've understood a little bit why, in spite of all the efforts, and there's still gender-based violence continues to rise. And that's why I think it's important that we examine art that tries to generate consciousness and bring forth change. So Elena Chauvet was born in Casas Grandes, Chihuahua. She's a Mexican artist who has devoted most of her life to denouncing feminicides in Mexico in general, and Ciudad Juarez in particular. Her artistic installation, Zapatos Rojos, Red Shoes, started in 2009, the year her sister was murdered. And in an interview, she said that she created this installation because it was about time to bring forth change. As we can observe, there are a series of shoes. There are as if they were participating in a procession, but they've been abandoned. And the reason why they've been abandoned and there's only the shoes is because, according to police reports, when a girl disappears, most of the times the only thing that's left behind is her shoes. Also, the shoes are there to visualize rather than quantify the disappeared. So it is a metaphoric reappearance of the vanished, according to Zimanek. Chauvet, though, has very specific conditions to start an installation. She collects used shoes. She never uses new shoes. Sometimes she gets those shoes from the woman's family and then paints them red to symbolize their blood, as most women are raped, murdered, and then dismembered. In future iterations of her installation, Chauvet has invited families to add a poem or a couple of lines, a phrase or two about their disappeared one. And also sometimes they've asked them to include a picture. On other occasions, Chauvet has encouraged visitors to interact with the shoes by writing notes and placing those inside a pair of shoes of their own choosing. Those notes, together with the symbolism of the shoes in lieu of the disappeared woman, constitute a dialogue that provides dignity, face, and perhaps a story to that woman who would otherwise be absent. Moreover, Zapatos Rojos always establishes a close connection to the participants who on occasions, as we can see here, may walk by, hold those shoes, and then even read those notes. Of course, as I've just said, she created, as the first person who did this, she created certain genre expectations. The shoe should be used and painted red, and the installation should be interactive. Her show has been adopted and adapted in many different countries across geographies and continents, which proves that her text is indeed a text that could provide a new transnational understanding of this particular, and could be used in our classrooms as a way to engage knowledge and engage practices from other contexts. Now I will briefly move, because I know I'm doing really badly on time, to the second installation. This is by Bahit Tuna. As I said before, he is a graphic artist. This particular installation is called Simpsons Untitled. He placed 440 pairs of new high-heel black shoes on the walls of a building named Yankee, which is part of a coffee chain contemporary art project in a very centric area of Istanbul. Here's another picture from a different perspective. And here is a third picture. From these three pictures I've just shown you, we can conclude that Tuna has engaged in certain gender transgressions. For one, his shoes are new, not used. He brought them from a store. They're high heels and they're black. The installation, as we saw in the last picture, is not interactive, as no one can really reach any truth. So he said, and it's true that in Turkish culture, when a family has a deceased person, then they place their shoes on the wall outside their house to honor that person. And black is indeed a color, but the artist still represents very heteropatriarchal and patriarchal also notions of female power. He has said in some of his interviews that he chose high heels because they're symbolic. They represent the power and the independence he would like for all women. As a researcher, I got a question, or I wonder whether he interviewed those 440 women, and then he concluded that they did not have any power or independence. This particular installation seems to also be caging women in certain roles, what's expected of them. He has said in interviews that his choice of high heels has been heavily critiqued, yet he still defends it. He says that he precisely chose those high heels as part of his criticism of society and how they were placing certain gender roles and expectations on women. A third breakage has to do with beauty. He says that he chose high heels because of aesthetic purposes. So again, this artist, male artist, perhaps Western even, although he's Turkish, but this very patriarchal notion of what beauty is, right? And a woman in high heels is beautiful and anything else. But what's interesting is that he talks about, you know, women are independent, women are working, and that's what he wanted to symbolize with high heels. But one wonders, there are so many jobs to which women cannot really wear high heels. So where he got that idea from is beyond me. And finally, and most troubling, some of the things he has said about the victims of violence has engaged in what I consider double victimization of the murdered women. So, for example, he said that he's not. He wanted women to be independent. He wanted them to have power. Again, assuming that those were women who had no power whatsoever, and how could he know that without interviewing them prior to the death, which kind of like defeats the purpose, right? So I'm finishing now. Sorry about that. So we can include indeed texts from the global South, because they could transgress, some of them do transgress boundaries, epistemic and or otherwise. As I said, Alina Chauvet's installation has been used across different continents and geographical spaces. So because, for example, she does generate a space for memorializing, for mourning, for humanizing the desaparecidas in and around northern Mexico through an empathic marking of public space, signaling the various colonial myths that have long perpetuated and naturalized these deaths. The red shoes denote the bodies of the murder victims through their sex and gender implications, as well as their status as commodities. The installations, like the work of various activist organizations in the region, claim space for mourning while calling for accountability, according to Zimanek. But on the other hand, some transgressions may not always be very
Can you
successful.
end off now, please, Pilar? Sorry.
And so my last comment was this one, that some transgressions may not always be successful in helping us decolonize academia, as is the case in Bahit Tuna's installation, because of the reasons I just shared. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for very rich sharing of some amazing artwork, and so sorry about the technological challenges. I think we do need to make a minute more for any pressing questions or comments. She's gone. She's gone. Pilar? Okay. Pilar, you're there. Any questions, comments from the floor? Yeah. I think she just put her camera off.
I'm here, sorry. I was trying to avoid having so many cameras going on the floor.
Thank you so much, and and well done for keeping our attention, even though we were all so exhausted at the end of the day. It was amazing. No comments? Danai. It's on its way. Are there any others that we can take 1, 2 at the same time? And then, yeah, any other hands up right now? Oh, Deirdre, last person. Yeah, we take the 2 together and hand over to Pilar.
Thank you, Pilar. It's a really quick one, I guess, based on your concluding remark about the use of some texts, because I guess the sentence was, we can use some text from the Global South, but not some others. I guess I would ask who we is, and on what conditions of that territory and use value that condition is made, because it's based on a certain set of rationales.
And I have a more playful remark, Pilar. After you had spent time showing us installations of shoes whilst wearing black and red yourself, I'm wondering who and what you're decolonizing.
Okay, before you answer, we have one final question or comment from Ulrika online. Ulrika, please go ahead.
I just wanted to thank you, Pilar, and also for all the others who use art and activism together. I think it's very important work, just to mention that, and I look forward to working together in the future in that direction. Thanks.
Thank you, Ulrika. Pilar.
Yes, thank you. So, who's we? So, if you remember at the very beginning of the presentation, I talked about guys like me,
The sound has gone funny again, I'm afraid.
Really? Oh.
Try again, Pilar.
Recording in progress.
Better? Better? Can you hear me now? Yes. Can you now hear me?
Yes, yes.
So if you remember at the very beginning of my presentation, I talked about how there are scholars like me who saw my undergrad and my master's is in literature, but then I have a PhD from rhetoric. So, but I've worked in English literature departments that were very classical. Most of my research is always about non-classical and not very Western centric as much as I can, because as we all know, we are in universities that ultimately sometimes control the curricula. So what I meant is scholars like me who are concerned about decolonizing the curriculum, who want to incorporate texts from other, from non-Western contexts. So, but what I meant by that is that I think the conditions that I was referring to is that we should still try to be careful in the texts that we bring in the sense that some texts like Bahit Tuna may be wonderful, or his idea of creating consciousness and awareness could be laudable, but ultimately he ends up perpetuating certain myths. And I'm not sure he actually has created a lot of social consciousness. I'm not sure I've answered your question. No, I haven't. Okay, sorry. The we has to do with scholars like me. So with people who are trying to change, to decolonize the curriculum. I could have said I, but that would have sounded a little bit too pompous, perhaps. But I didn't mean, so yeah. But that's what I meant.
Thanks, Pilar. Did you want to respond?
I mean, I guess I also want to decolonize, but I'm not being.
I
guess I would say the non-identification with the we is not because of not decolonizing curricula. It's, I guess, where the center of the we lies and how that collective has come to be understood, because there can be terrible global South scholars. There's many of them. It's a thing that anyone can do from any place. And reproduct. So the rationale for me is confusing, because I could also pick global North scholars who are terrible and make a decision about including or not including. So the orientation to inclusion is not the gesture for the curriculum change.
Okay, fair enough. So I'm thinking this particular project was before in my previous university. In my current university, for example, what I've engaged, I'm teaching a course on intercultural communication. And for example, that course was taught with texts that were exclusively Western and from a very business perspective. So I tried to bring in texts from different perspectives and different also global geographies. But of course, I understand that, so I guess ultimately the question is, why should I be doing this? How am I qualified to do this? And I don't have a good answer. This is just more a reflection. I'm not saying this is what you meant, but now that you asked this question, yes. Thing is, in this particular university, as I said, I was handed down a curriculum, and I did not agree with many of the texts that I found problematic, most of the texts that we were teaching. And that's what motivated my revising, my decolonizing the curriculum. But the we is not it's not a generic or a group kind of identity. It's mostly me. I have.
Thank you so much, Pilar. Thank you to all three presenters. It's been an amazing session. It's the end of our conference, and I'm going to ask Divya Bana, who I want to say a very big thank you to come up and say final words. But just from me, I want to say that you are all amazing. Everybody who stayed, who's been here, the IT, the photographers, it's just been amazing. Divya.
Thank
so
you.
much, Tammy. I'm so pleased that it was you that chaired the last session. We've been really, on the point with time, and I'm so glad that I began the conference yesterday with thanking people even in advance. So I want to quickly, in less than a minute, say thank you so much to Beth, to Ring's executive, to Ring's members, to all of you present here today. But I do not want to forget University of KwaZulu-Natal. And usually we just say UKZN, but I'm saying University of KwaZulu-Natal, because you have really been such a big star, including our keynote, not to take away from our keynote speaker as well, but you have held us together, corporate relations and ICS. I am so, so thankful. Thank you so much, Shakila, for putting all of this together and making it easier on us. So next year, if I'm under 1 minute, next year, the conference will be held in Germany, Paderborn University, Paderborn. We hope to see you there. Thank you very, very, very much to all of you. Stay safe.